and welcome to the Divorce Lab. We're a group of independent professionals working to help educate the public on various topics related to divorce. I am Carrie Goldring, a certified divorce lending professional who specializes in mortgage planning.
And I'm Mark Avezai. I'm a certified divorce financial analyst. I work primarily in Troy, Michigan.
Hi, I'm Jim Chryssikos. I'm a family law attorney and mediator located in Troy, Michigan. So let's get started with today's show. And today we have a special guest, divorce mediator, Lisa Taylor. Hi, Lisa.
Hello.
So Lisa, thank you for joining us. Why don't you start by telling us a little bit about yourself and a little bit about your style of mediation?
Okay, I am an attorney. I've been an attorney for a really long time, and I'm not going to say how many years because it dates me. But starting about 17 years ago, I stopped going to court and started mediating full time, and I do it for so many reasons. So my style of mediation is to actually try to get people before they even file. So pre-filing mediation. The idea is to settle everything before you even go to court, so that going to court just becomes process and paperwork, and it's the easiest thing. So most of my clients tell me they're in front of a judge for 5 minutes, whole different thing. So basically I work with the clients, and my goal is to help them talk to each other, listen to each other, stay calm and rational, and make the decisions they need to make so they can move forward for themselves and their families. There's lots of ins and outs about how that works, but basically that's the goal, is to help give them the voice, the power and control to make the decisions for themselves, their children, their finances, their family, so they can move forward in a healthy way.
Lisa, quick question for you. Does that mean that the two clients come to you and they find you together, or is that a situation where they find attorneys first and the attorneys come to you? How does that typically work?
Most often one party finds me. And sometimes they're referred by an attorney who they contacted, who, and they maybe have expressed that they don't want to go to war, and they've heard terrible stories about litigation and they want to avoid that. And so attorneys who are familiar with my process may refer them to me. But a lot of times one spouse just finds me, either from a referral from a friend or family member or whomever, or actually from financial people or therapists or Carrie, people like, who work in other fields who've worked with me and who want to help them find my process. So they find me, usually one person finds me, they call me up, I explain my process. If they like it, and I tell them to go to my website, or they've gone to my website so they know about it, then they will talk with their spouse and say, hey, I found this process I think is going to be really good for our family. I like this person. Why don't you give her a call and see what you think? And so then the other person will call me and I'll have the same conversation, explain my process, answer their questions. And then if they're both on board, then we move forward with my process. That's usually how it works.
And when that happens, at a certain point in the process, you make a decision that maybe it's a case that you should refer out to attorneys, or maybe they don't need to talk to attorneys. How do you make that call and that judgment call if it's a case where they should have representation, or is there ever a case where you say, I don't think they need legal representation at all?
Yeah. So first of all, after the initial calls where I explain my process, I do another set of what I call telephone screenings with each of them separately. And that is where I ask the more personal questions about their relationship and how they communicate and so forth. And first of all, it is to make sure mediation is appropriate for their case, because not every case is appropriate. I think most are, to be honest with you, unless there's domestic violence or some reason that there really cannot be two equal bargaining partners. But a lot of times what I find is that either they are capable of doing it, and I feel like, it can just be the three of us, or they're not equal bargaining partners. And then what I will do is say, I think we need to have attorneys in this case to help just level the playing field, not because I want them to become adversaries, right? And I have a list of attorneys that I trust. Jim is one of them, who support this process, just sort of share my values of families, that, just because you're divorcing doesn't mean you're not kind of a family, especially if you have children, right? You have to be the parents of those kids for the rest of your lives. I mean, that's your reality. And so I have attorneys who I trust who share that value. And so even if they have two attorneys, we can still have a really nice collaborative process. But yeah, sometimes I feel like we have to have attorneys or else it's not going to be two equal bargaining partners. And like, I don't want to be a part of a process where I feel one person doesn't have a fair voice, right? Like where one person's just so much stronger than they are for whatever reason, knowledge or just ability to advocate for themselves or whatever it is. I don't want to be a part of that either. I want to make sure that everybody has all the information they need to make knowing voluntary decisions.
And is it true that at the end, when you're done negotiating the settlement agreement, that you would have an attorney review it and do the paperwork anyway?
So, well, they're two different things, whether the attorney reviews it to give them advice versus the court paperwork. So I'll just deal with that separately. So I always recommend to clients, even if I don't say you must have attorneys in this case, or I'm not going to take it, like if after the screening, even if I don't say that, I always recommend that they go to an attorney with particularly, hopefully one that I trust, to one, give them just some advice about how to negotiate in between sessions, right? So they really so I know they're educated. But two, like you just said, to look the agreement over before they sign it, because once they sign it, it is a binding legal contract. They're going to be bound to that. And so it's really a good idea before you sign any contract, right, to have an attorney review it. So I do encourage them, but I don't require it. Part of it is because one of the tenets of mediation is self-determination. And so my job is to give them the information, make sure they understand why it's a good idea to have attorneys and what they might be risking if they don't. But it's not my job to make them do anything really, other than have a fair process.
Lisa, talk a little bit about these dynamics or these situations where maybe one spouse clearly wants to have an attorney, because then this comes up all of you, as you said, we've worked together on cases in the past. But these situations where one spouse either clearly needs or wants their own attorney and the other spouse is just adamant that they don't want an attorney, how do you handle a case like that?
It really depends on the case. Oftentimes I will say to the one who adamantly doesn't want an attorney, I try to convince them that they should probably have one, because they're going to be in a disadvantage, which is if we're in a session together and the other person's attorney says, well, you know what, I really think from my experience when I go to court that what you're saying would never happen, or this is what would happen. The other party can't say, well, that's not true, because they don't know. They're just, so it's not a level playing field. So that's one aspect of it where I would really encourage them to have an attorney. The other aspect is if one person really wants an attorney because they feel like they need to have an attorney or they're not going to be able to participate in mediation, it kind of depends on the reason. If the reason is because there's some domestic violence, not necessarily physical violence, but like power and control issues, and where they're just not going to be an equal advocate for lots of reasons, in that case, I wouldn't do the mediation unless both parties had an attorney, and I would have a really long conversation with the person who felt that they had been abused, to make sure that they felt mediation was appropriate and that they felt they could be safe and that it was going to work. So in those kinds of cases, I would require two attorneys. Most times I really, really strongly urge it because I feel like it's not going to be successful if one person has an attorney and the other person doesn't. And if one person just won't do what I say, then I'll say, you know what, I guess I'm not your mediator, right? I mean, I want to make sure it's a good process for everybody.
And when you have attorneys, the idea is not for the attorney to say, we're going to ask for this and we're going to ask for that, right? Like, even though you have an attorney there, it's not for the purpose of fighting or winning or.
Right, exactly right. And and that's the hardest, that's one of my biggest hurdles, like what Jim just said, like when one person, I don't want attorneys, because they've heard the horror stories about what can happen with attorneys, and no disrespect to litigating attorneys, but some of them are wonderful, like Jim, because he does a lot of litigation as well as collaborative stuff. But some are like, they're fighters and they want to fight and they want to win. And actually, to be honest, our system is set up that way. Like, our ethical obligation as attorneys is to zealously advocate for our client. That's what it says. Well, if you're zealously advocating for your client and the other person's zealously advocating for their client, it's a war. I mean, that's really what it is. And so you can go through months and months of just fighting and paying your attorneys so many hours of work and getting nowhere and not talking settlement at all. And so that is what people are scared of. And I can have Jim talk to this, but the attorneys in my process, their goal, their job is to do something so different. It's to be a partner with each attorney, with each party, I'm sorry, to really just help them advocate for themselves, really. That's kind of the goal. Like what I always say is if in a mediation session, the attorneys don't say a word, that's awesome. That just means the parties are doing a great job. But the attorneys are there in case they're needed. And so, Jim, I think I'm going to throw it back to you. Like, how do you look at it different from when you do a litigated case?
Yeah, when I first started doing cases with Lisa, that was really the sharpest learning curve, is not butting in where I wasn't needed, letting them speak for themselves rather than being their representative or their mouthpiece, which I am when we're in litigation. We're in court. I speak for the client. The clients usually don't speak unless they're under examination of some sort. But in mediation, like this sort of mediation that Lisa does, early stage, taking that back seat. You know, we trust that we've prepared and talked about certain things prior to the session. We'll discuss more after the session is over. But when things are moving in the right direction, don't get in the way. Now, that doesn't mean that if I think a client is stepping on a landmine, I'll keep my mouth shut. Obviously, I'll express myself if I need to, or I'll ask for a breakout session if I think the client's making a mistake and we need to talk about it for a little while. Or I just need to make sure that they understand what they're agreeing to before we put it in stone, right? So that was the toughest thing for me. And I'm a collaboratively trained attorney. I do collaborative divorce work in addition to litigation. So I've been trained and I've had these trainings to kind of step out of the litigation mode once in a while. And even then, it was still hard for me to get used and acclimated to that process. But I think I've come along.
No, you do a really good job. I mean, the attorneys who I like the most are the ones who just get it. That the parties are the ones who have to live with these agreements. They're the ones, once they sign it, once the judge says it's a judgment of divorce, once they're done, we go away. The attorneys are done. But the parties and their children, they are the ones who have to live the agreement. And so it's so important for them to do as much of the work, the talking, the communication as possible. And for, like Jim said, the attorneys to just sort of stand back. And it's a really big paradigm shift. I remember when I went through mediator training, my first training was in '99. And that was the big, like, I even remember it almost felt like my brain, I had a shift. Like, wait, the parties can make these decisions. They don't need me to tell them what to do. That is a big shift because as attorneys, that's our job, is to tell our clients what to do, to give them advice. And so, yeah, so attorneys like Jim and other people on my list have had that paradigm shift where they're there to be a partner, an educator, a supporter, to give whatever's needed, but not to say you must do this or you must not do that.
You know what I know too from working with you, Lisa, is you ask really good, thought-provoking questions. So it's not like you just say, well, when do you want to visit your children? Like, you ask questions to come up with how to settle a case, knowing what direction you're going in. So you do, I don't know if I want to say steering is a good word, but you definitely are navigating with questions and answers to get people to a place where they should be. You're not just saying, you guys do it, and if you fight, I step in.
Yeah, I think just to jump in on that, I agree with you. I think what happens, what I notice is that when people are done with the process, Lisa's process, they feel like they really made their own agreement rather than being steered or pushed into an agreement that maybe they aren't. I think the outcomes in this process and Lisa's process are better, more long-lasting outcomes, because I do think they walk away from it feeling like this is their agreement that they came to on their own, even though they were guided throughout.
Right, well, thank you. That's, that's what I want to hear, right? Obviously.
Yeah.
And so I do have a settlement agreement template that I've designed. And so so when I was trained as a mediator, what they tell you is like, set an agenda. What's important to you? What do you want to talk about?
Yeah.
I don't do that in divorce mediation. I know all the issues that have to be discussed. I don't know what the answers to those issues are. But I know the issues, like co-parenting issues. How are you going to co-parent together once you're living in separate homes? A silly one I bring up is like the children's clothes shall be washed prior to returning to the other parent. That sounds ridiculous, right? But those are the things people fight about after divorce. I'm always sending clean clothes to your house. You're always sending back dirty laundry. I'm doing your laundry. It's not fair. So those are the things. So I bring up stuff. I think that's probably what you're referring to, Carrie, is like I bring up a lot of things that people wouldn't even think of. It doesn't mean they have to put it in their agreement, but I offer it to them as a thing to think about. Hey, at least make sure you're on the same page about it, whether we put it in writing or we don't put it in writing. And I go through that. So I just say co-parenting issues, what's parenting plan, regular schedule, vacation schedule, holiday schedule, then we have to do child support. And so I do have a template to make sure that we touch on every issue. I do ask a lot of questions, play devil's advocate, but I do try really hard not to tell them what the answers to those issues are, like to just give a bunch of options and stuff, because as Jim said, I want them to feel like it's their agreement, not mine.
Thank you for listening to us today. You can find us on the divorcelab.com. You can feel free to take a look at our other episodes, and you can also leave some questions or comments for us on there as well.